Alaska was purchased for a number of reasons. However, this purchase generated the most controversial uproar that America had ever had over a state purchase. The Russian government offered to sell Alaska to the USA in 1866, but the purchase was not effected until the 30th of March 1867, when William Seward, the USA Secretary of State, signed a purchase agreement on behalf of the USA. Seward had pushed for the expansion of America and negotiated the deal with the Russian minister to the USA, Edward D. Stoeckel. William Seward helped America gain 600,000 square miles of land for about 2 cents an acre. Between 10,000 and 40,000 years ago, the early ancestors of America's indigenous people walked over a land bridge that connected northeastern Siberia to northwestern America. These early groups of people later dispersed into 3 separate groups, which were called Aleut, Eskimo, and Indian. Alaska was not discovered again by people from overseas until the Russians came. The first Russians to settle were small groups in 1741, led by Vitus Bering and Alexei Shirokov. They were followed shortly after by fur hunters, but the first permanent settlement was not established until 1784 on Kodiak Island. 15 years later, the Russian-American Company, managed by Alexander Baranov, was granted control over the area and established its headquarters in Sitka. The Tlingit Indians took over Sitka in 1802, but they lost the town and war with Russia 2 years after. Later, the fur trade began to fluctuate, as the sea otters and fur-bearing seals were being wiped out by the Russians' overhunting. Development was hampered by diminishing fur supply and inability to make settlements self-sustainable, and the Russians came to view the icy wasteland as a liability which they were happy to relinquish for the $7.2 million the USA offered. Alaska was occupied by Russia, but the cost of fighting and then losing the Crimean War severely changed Russian priorities. In 1855 and 1856, French and British warships besieged, though failed, to capture Petropavlovsk on the Russian mainland. However, the security of Russian America diminished, as did the capacity of Russia to defend it. Initially, the Russian ruler, the Tsar, and his advisors began discussing how to improve Alaska's colony and defend it, but concluded that Alaska was a liability. The idea of selling it appealed especially as war had left Russia financially weak. Some advisors also thought that it was best to focus on Asia, as the fur resources of the Amur River basin in China were unexploited and that area was easier to defend and cheaper to supply. Therefore, the Tsar and his advisors agreed that Alaska, Russian America, should be sold so that they could focus on Asia. While there had been some earlier discussions about the USA acquiring Alaska, more positive interest did not eventuate until 1860, when the prospect of buying Alaska became more likely. While the American Civil War delayed negotiations, by the time it ended in 1866, Russia was close to bankruptcy and could not afford to support Alaska or fight for it. William H. Seward was keen to expand USA territory and saw a great opportunity to do so through the purchase of Alaska. While other politicians were less enthusiastic, the Senate did approve the purchase treaty, although only by 1 vote. Through negotiations between Seward and Russia's minister to the USA, Edward D. Stoeckel, Alaska was purchased on March 30, 1867. The purchase agreement was approved by the US Senate in May 27, 1867. The actual release of the funds to pay $7.2 million for the purchase price was approved by the U.S. House of Representatives in 1868. The estimated 30,000 natives in Alaska, who might have been considered as the true owners of the land, were not consulted, and the deal was concluded between the Russians and the Americans. America's political leaders had showed interest in Alaska since the 1840s, when Californian senators appeared interested, as stated in Charles Sumner's speech. This interest came during America's fixation with the doctrine of manifest destiny, which meant to expand their control across the continent. This was a continuation of the broader approach taken by US politicians that had seen the purchase of Louisiana from France and Florida from Spain. Purchasing Alaska would increase the size of America by 20%. The Monroe Doctrine went hand in hand with the Manifest Destiny. The Monroe Doctrine was the idea that was formed which allowed the USA to establish themselves as a potential world power, where European nations were stopped from being in North and South America's affairs, and the USA would do the same in return. This policy was a way to separate the New World from the Old World. Consistently pursuing these policies formed the basis for America's development as a world power and challenged the long-standing supremacy of European nations. In doing so, they began the isolationist policy, where America basically ignored Europe. This provoked them to continue making their very independent country bigger to gain more power and keep the Europeans out of their newly growing country, which was being progressively acquired by Americans from its previous foreign owners. Charles Sumner was an important senator at the time, and he made a historic speech in 1867. Charles Sumner saw the purchase as a good thing. He thought it benefited them in many ways. Not only did he see such advantages as the prospective fur trade, fishing, and mining opportunities, but also the advantages of having a mutually agreeable arrangement with Russia, as it would strengthen the good understanding between the two countries. He also mentioned specific benefits such as shorter shipping routes that they will gain, which will save them money. Sumner also saw Alaska as another great achievement that America had made to expand their country. William Seward played a big part in the purchase, along with his supporters and other significant people such as Charles Sumner. They saw that the land was a bargain price for $7.2 million in gold, for its large size, unexploited resources, strategic value, and for its great alternative to the much more expensive option of protecting a long border from a potentially hostile foreign country. The political environment made it easier for Seward to purchase it, because not only did Russia have little interest or resources to retain Alaska, but Great Britain, that had just defeated Russia in the Crimean War, would have been content if Russian influence was also removed from its North American interests. However, Great Britain did not appear sufficiently interested in acquiring Alaska itself, therefore the USA had no one to rival its bid. By the 1850s, Russia had gathered information on every known resource that was available in Alaska. However, there were not many resources in Alaska, as their attempts to hunt whales, mine coal, or find a large enough amount of gold to warrant a mining development failed. Therefore, Russia's interest in the country had dramatically decreased. It was clear that they had no use for the icy wasteland anymore. By 1860, the Russians were willing to sell Alaska, as they saw little value in the land, and by 1867 could not afford to maintain a viable presence there. They also urgently needed funds, so to them it was logical to dispose of a low-value, high-maintenance cost asset for a substantial price. America was also interested in minimizing opportunities for foreign nations to intrude on US domestic affairs, as had occurred during the Civil War and earlier in US history. By eliminating any Russian claims in North America, this would successfully remove any potential interference and conflict, especially as Russian North American claims had credence for south of present-day Alaska. Clearing Russian claims in North America was the primary reason for the purchase, and the price was a pittance compared to the cost of a war. William Seward was appointed the Secretary of State by the President Abraham Lincoln on the 5th of March, 1861. His determination to expand America was widely recognized. William Seward bought the state hoping to find good resources, and he knew of the rumors about the fish, fur, and gold that was supposed to be there. Not only did he have the urge to turn this purchase into profit, but there were also political reasons that surpassed expectations. The Alaska purchase became Seward's greatest achievement during his years as Secretary of State. When asked about his greatest achievement, he said, "The purchase of Alaska, but it will take the people a generation to find it out." On the 30th of March 1867, William Seward signed the purchase agreement, and in May 27, 1867, it was approved by the US Senate. President Andrew Johnson signed the final treaty and made the transfer on October 18, 1867, in Sitka. The initial response from many in the community, and especially the media, was that the purchase was a waste of money and for an icy wasteland they didn't need. It was called Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and Andrew Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. This is not perhaps surprising, as America had just undergone a bitter civil war, and there were still immediate issues such as reconciliation and reconstruction that occupied the attention of the American public. Also, although America now owned an additional 586,412 square miles of land, it must be remembered that it already had vast tracts of virtually unexploited or even unexplored land, such as Texas and Arizona, and the West Coast and its hinterland that were sparsely populated. It would have been difficult for most people to conceptualize how a vast area of what was seen as virtually uninhabitable ice and snow would be of much value. Here are a few articles that give us an insight into the public's reaction at the time. However, some commentators begrudgingly recognized the strategic value of Alaska, as well as acknowledging unenthusiastically that Alaska had future commercial potential. Other commentators were more positive and saw Seward as having made a shrewd and valuable acquisition. Another important opinion was the natives who were disgruntled by the fact that their country had been sold by Russians whom were not true Alaskans. The estimated 30,000 natives in Alaska were the true owners, however the Russians had assumed ownership along with the right to sell Alaska. The natives' response was that they had no right to sell their country. The purchase had been made without the natives having a say, which sparked arguments. A native group called the Tlingit believed that their fathers originally owned all the country but allowed the Russians to occupy it for their mutual benefit, in that articles desired by them could be obtained from Russians in exchange for furs. Over the years, there were many disputes between America and the Tlingits. However, there was little the natives could do, until years later when the Tlingit and Haida Indians finally were able to properly sue in the US federal court by claiming ownership of the Alaskan lands in 1867. The court did agree, and this dispute was eventually settled when America paid a small settlement. However, this opinion of Alaska was changed once Alaska was discovered by gold explorers, tourists, and oil companies, and after many years the Americans struck gold. This resource made billions, which brought it revenue, money, jobs, developments, and people. It was soon clear that Alaska was a great choice, and William Seward was a genius. Charleston was one of the southern states of America. There was an article in the newspaper at the time, just after the purchase had been made, which discussed Charleston's views on the purchase. They saw it as an achievement, stating that the treaty Seward made was a wise choice, and they believed that they would too reap the benefits, such as, once they join the Union, it will be a fair bit bigger than it once was. The article acknowledges that some people doubt the purchase, but the article goes on to talking about the gold mining, fishing, and fur-bearing benefits. This was just a snippet from the entire article. There were a number of forces in America who were working towards the Alaska purchase. Everything came together at the right time, as Britain had no say. America was obsessed with the Manifest Destiny, and Seward did it under the radar so that all the critics voiced their opinions long after the agreement had been reached. At the time of the purchase, many named it Seward's Folly. However, in today's world, it is seen as a huge achievement due to Alaska's current gross state product of $45 billion, and what could be argued was its far more valuable strategic importance.